Cheap, adjective. Cheaper, cheapest. Low price. 1. Costing little money or less money than you expected. Synonym: inexpensive. Cheap fares. Personal computers are cheap and getting cheaper. Cycling is a cheap way to get around. The printer isn't exactly cheap at £200. Immigrant workers used as a source of cheap labor. Workers who are paid very little, especially unfairly. A good education is not cheap. British English. Calls cost 36p a minute, cheap rate. See also dirt cheap. Opposite, expensive. Related entries, cost and payment. 2. Charging low prices. A cheap restaurant, hotel. A cheap taxi firm. British English. We found a cheap and cheerful cafe, one that is simple and charges low prices but is pleasant. Opposite, expensive. Poor quality. 3. Disapproving. Low in price and quality. Cheap perfume. Jewelry. Shoes. British English. A cheap and nasty bottle of wine. Unkind. 4. Unpleasant or unkind and rather obvious. I was tired of his cheap jokes at my expense. A comedian who is always looking for cheap laughs. To score a cheap political advantage. Related entries, describing unpleasant traits. Low status. 5. Disapproving. Having a low status and therefore not deserving respect. He's just a cheap cook. His treatment of her made her feel cheap, ashamed, because she had lost her respect for herself. Not generous. 6. North American English. British English. Mean. Informal. Disapproving. Not liking to spend money. Don't be so cheap. Extra examples. It's a good restaurant and incredibly cheap. Shoes like that don't come cheap. The bag looks cheap and nasty. The glasses are plain without looking cheap. The school managed to get a couple of computers on the cheap. They are selling fabrics cheap this week. A brand new radio going cheap. A quality pair of Italian shoes doesn't come cheap. Don't be so cheap. He was so generous he made the other guests look cheap. He's just trying to score a cheap political advantage. He's so cheap, he'd never fly to London in a million years. His treatment of her made her feel cheap. I was tired of her cheap jokes at my expense. It was just a bottle of cheap perfume. Italy was a very cheap country to visit in those days. She was just too cheap to buy a real present. The market has been flooded with cheap imports. The printer isn't exactly cheap at £200. The room was filled with the smell of cheap perfume. The skirt was dirt cheap. The town is full of immigrant workers, used as a source of cheap labor. They are offering incredibly cheap fares to Eastern Europe. They've got brand new CD players going cheap. We brought a few cheap and nasty bottles of wine home from holiday. We found a cheap and cheerful cafe. A cheap fruity, tart, Whore. The watch was suspiciously cheap. It was probably a fake. Cheap and nasty products with brand names you've never heard of.